All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, when I first started watching professional sports at the beginning of the early 90s, that was at the tail end of a particular generation of so-called black athlete that wanted theirs. They wanted their individual recognition, but they put winning first. So when I watched Jerry Rice play or Michael Jordan or Barry Bonds, what always spoke to me as I watched them perform, within their particular sport was that they wanted to shine, but they wanted to win. Now, in the mid-90s, the hip-hop athletes started to come into the NBA and into the NFL. And it was a bit more of that me-first mentality. And then by the late 90s, it was the quote-unquote gangster rap athlete that started to emerge. And don't get it twisted. I was raised on the same music as them because I'm a couple of years younger than most of those guys who entered the fray of the professional sports world in the mid-90s. But I did notice a psychological change in the way in which those athletes wanted to be perceived and the energy that they gave off, particularly Allen Iverson in basketball, Michael Vick in football, as well as Randy Moss in football. Yes, they wanted to compete hard and they wanted to win, but they wanted to make sure that it was always done their way, and they tended to put themselves above the team. And what that led to, in my view, was untapped potential. Randy Moss is by far the most gifted wide receiver I've ever seen. To me, it's not even much of a conversation. The cat could run a 4.1 40, had a 40-inch vertical, had hands as soft as pillows. But what he was missing were certain intangibles that Jerry Rice had, that Michael Irvin had, that he was never going to have. And that's why when you compare Jerry Rice, not only to Randy Moss, but other wide receivers, you have to have seen him play. Jerry Rice had a Tom Brady component to him where he didn't run the fastest, he didn't jump the highest, but in the biggest moments, he was going to make a play. You were never going to view a big playoff game or an NFC championship game, much less a Super Bowl, where you were going to say, where's Jerry Rice at? He can't get open? He can't make a play? The cat always made huge plays, no matter who the defense was or where they were playing at. The only big playoff game that I can think of offhand where he was pretty much a non-factor was that playoff game against the Giants in 1986. By then, probably 1987. It was in the playoffs of the 1986 season, where the 49ers lost 49-3, and Joe Montana got knocked out of the game by Jim Burt. But that Giants team, that was a steamroller. They were going to smash any and everyone that they faced. But Jerry Rice always came up big in the clutch. He always came up big in the biggest games, and you can't say that about Randy Moss. So Randy Moss coming out and claiming that he thinks that he's the greatest wide receiver ever, clearly he's going according to tangibles and not intangibles, because when it comes to intangibles, it's not even close. Jerry Rice would go across the middle, get his block knocked off. He would run every route. Just as a blocker, he by far is the greatest blocking wide receiver of all time. I'm not sure if there's a highlight reel of his blocks, but there was a game that the 49ers played in the 1989 season where they went 14-2. And John Taylor had two 90-plus yard touchdowns from Joe Montana, where, what they call yak today. The 49ers basically invented that. The West Coast offense was basically created to take advantage of wide receivers who could catch short passes and take it all the way to the house. And that's what Jerry Rice and John Taylor were known for. And on that particular night, it happened to be John Taylor's night. He had something like 9 catches or 10 catches for well over 200 yards. And John had 2 plays in that game that were both 90-plus yard touchdowns. And on both of those plays, Jerry Rice was blocking all the way down the field. He was just an incredible athlete overall. If you evaluate athletics or great athleticism by numerous things and not just the tangibles of how fast you run and how high you jump. So to me, it's not even close. And to be quite frank with you, it's pretty disrespectful that Randy Moss would even say this, but I know why he's saying it. Because basically, that type of dude, very similar to a LeBron James, he's concerned about the political aspect of who people consider to be the best. So he's throwing his name out there so that maybe it'll catch fire on social media and the younger kids will jump on board with Randy Moss. But for those of us who saw Jerry Rice play, it's a lot like those of us who saw Michael Jordan play. And we scoff at the notion of a Kobe Bryant or LeBron James because we saw the real thing. It's the same thing with Jerry. There have been many great wide receivers since Jerry Rice, Randy Moss being one of them. T.O., a.k.a. Terrell Owens, Megatron, Antonio Brown, Larry Fitzgerald. But if you combine all of those players together, they don't have the impact that Jerry Rice had in the biggest games. Jerry Rice won a Super Bowl MVP in Super Bowl 23. And every Super Bowl that he played in, he had well over 100 yards receiving, except for that last one when he was in Oakland, when they squared off against one of the great defenses of all time in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I think that Jerry was 39 or 40 years old in that game, and he still scored a touchdown. So, I mean, there's no disrespect to Randy Moss. I saw him in 2 Super Bowls, one against the Giants in 07 when they had the perfect record, and he came up small in that game. And the other one when he was older with the 49ers when they played the Baltimore Ravens in 2013. Nothing against the brother, but look at his playoff stats. You can go game by game looking at Randy Moss's effect in each playoff game, and he can get taken out of his zone. He could get removed. You could not remove Jerry Rice. But anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
Renee in the house, and Renee, we have some NFL wide receiver drama. Who is the greatest of all time? Man, that is the controversy right now. Now, if people haven't heard about this, Randy Moss created a little bit of controversy when he was recently on Terrell Owens' podcast, and the
Love Randy Moss, but he's basically the Allen Iverson of the NFL. That's what he is. He's a dude who's been overly glorified since he's left the league. But for those of us who saw him play, incredible talent. But when it comes to the overall impact that he had as a wide receiver in big games, not even close. Now, pop culture wise, he's probably a greater contributor to the quote unquote culture, as they say, than Jerry Rice was. He has his own slogan named after him: "You got mossed." Nobody says you got riced. Well, that's because Jerry Rice was known for so many things. If you were to say you got riced, no one's quite sure what you're talking about. You're talking about someone who could beat the defense down the field in a fly pattern or a post pattern? Are you talking about him catching a 5-yard crossing route and taking it to the house? Are you talking about him blocking his man and 2 other secondary players all the way down the field while his running back scores? What are you talking about when you say you got riced? You know what somebody's talking about when they say you got mossed. No, they mean that a receiver caught the ball and faked out the defender and took it to the house.
Topic turned to just who was the GOAT when it comes to the wide receivers. Rather than me explaining, let's hear it from the man himself, Randy Moss, and this is the statement that kicked off an entire controversy.
Randy, who's the best receiver to ever play in the NFL?
You talking to him
already? Okay, so
I put
Look at T.O. on the left. T.O. like, no, this nigga didn't.
First, I'll put T.O. second, and I think Jerry's probably third or fourth. I'm talking about.
Now you can tell by how he said that he and Jerry seem to have some type of personal beef. The dynamic between him and Jerry seems to be very similar to the dynamic between Michael Jordan and LeBron James.
Dominating the game and changing the game of football.
All right, so there it was. And look, most people agree that Jerry Rice is the greatest ever, and Randy Moss, 2, 3, 4, T.O. top 5 for sure.
I'm not even quite sure if I will put Randy Moss 2. I'm on record as stating, just in my view, the best receiver that I've seen since Jerry Rice, in my honest opinion, when it comes to a receiver who could do everything, go across the middle, sideline patterns, go deep, make big plays, and make big plays in big games, is Antonio Brown. Now, unfortunately for Antonio Brown, he has not had that many opportunities in big games. But in the big games that I've seen him, he was dominant. He wasn't just good, he was dominant. I remember that playoff game that they had against the Jacksonville Jaguars. He was incredible in that game. And he was being guarded by Jalen Ramsey and the guy on the other side as well. I mean, he was dominating the both of them.
A lot of people were talking about this. It started a conversation, a big-time debate.
Jerry Rice used to take so many big hits going across the middle. And as we know, Randy Moss is known as a guy who did not go across the middle. At least did not like going across the middle. Jerry Rice didn't give a shit.
I played a little high school football. We're not really experts when it comes to the NFL wide receivers, but we talked to a guy who knows what he's talking about. Tyreek Hill might be the most explosive wide receiver in the NFL.
Right, but asking Tyreek Hill about who's the best wide receiver in history, That's like asking one of these little 22-year-olds in the NBA who's better, Jordan or LeBron. You already know what they're going to say because they're going to go by what they grew up on. That's why that Last Dance documentary was so impactful, because it gave a lot of these younger dudes a chance to get a glimpse of the energy of Michael Jordan, and you saw a lot of them flipped over to Jordan and saying that they now view him as the greatest ever. People like Trae Young and the brother out there with the Memphis Grizzlies, Ja Morant. They were saying, well, you know, before I thought it was LeBron, now I think it's Jordan. Just from a 10-part documentary. Imagine living through his era.
Now, and we posed this question. Settle the debate for us, Tyreek. Who truly...
And by the way, Tyreek Hill is the best wide receiver in the NFL right now. I made a video about that a long time ago. Just in my humble opinion, he's the best wide receiver overall in the NFL right now.
The best when it comes to the wide receivers. And this is what Tyreek Hill had to say.
Who's Tyreek Hill's GOAT?
Man, everybody know I'm going to say Randy Moss. Randy Moss was my favorite player growing up. And Randy Moss is my favorite player of all time. Randy Moss, man. Randy Moss is the GOAT of all wide receivers. Because you got to think about it. If you want a wide receiver, like he just changed the game. 6'4", run a 4.2, can create separation, can run routes, can catch the ball. Like, come on. Like
I give you all that. But once again, I'll take Antonio Brown over Randy Moss. I'll take a prime Megatron over Randy Moss. I'll take T.O. probably over Randy Moss. Now, Randy Moss has way better hands than T.O. But if it's a big playoff game, I need somebody who's going to make a play and who'll go across the middle. I'm taking T.O.
Well, I understand Jerry got the stats and he got the touchdowns. He got all this. He can run.
See, he's talking like someone who never saw Jerry play. He's talking like someone who all he can do is look at the record books and say, okay, wow, he had some big seasons. But you had to have watched Jerry play. He had a real Tom Brady type of vibe to him where he wasn't the fastest. Once again, he was not the most explosive. But he always made the biggest plays in the biggest games. And he used to go against Deion Sanders, and early on in Deion's career, Jerry would dominate Deion. To the point where they would not even put Deion on Jerry. They would put Deion on John Taylor. And put, I think, Tim McKyer on Jerry. Jerry had a 5-touchdown game against the Falcons in Deion's second or third season. And I'm not even quite sure if any of those touchdowns were on Deion because they refused to put Deion on Jerry.
But if I'm picking a receiver, you know, who's going to make me some plays in crunch times when I need them.
Name me some crunch time plays that Randy Moss made, Tyreek. Over the course of his 15, 16-year career, name me 10 crunch time plays that Randy Moss made. Randy played in 2 Super Bowls. Name me the standout play that Randy made in either one of those Super Bowls. He caught that little bunny pass from Tom Brady down the stretch of that first Super Bowl in 2007, where they ended up losing the game anyway. Other than that, he was quiet throughout the game.
Randy Moss, definitely. The body of work, man. Randy is different, man. I still...
He is different. I give him that.
Study him sometime, and I'm like, man, how is he able to do this at 6'4", running this fast? Like, how?
His acceleration was incredible. I remember watching Randy at Marshall the year before he was drafted, obviously. And his game-breaking ability was like something I'd never seen before. He was incredible. I remember in the 90s, there were some great wide receivers that I saw in college. I remember Joey Galloway was a standout at Ohio State. Randy Moss at Marshall. I remember Keyshawn at USC because I think he won the Heisman. That's how great he was. Now, there were some great wide receivers in college that I saw, but Randy Moss was the one who really stood out.
Like, man, do God only make these players like once in a generation? Like, come on, man. Like, this is crazy.
Wow.
Yo, I love it. That's a big compliment, but you know I'm not about to disagree. Hello, Randy Moss is the homie. He's West Virginia blood, as you know. So, of course, and honestly, to his point, there are certain things, like I'm sure a lot of people do think that Jerry Rice is the greatest of all time.
Because he is.
But a lot of people solely base all their decisions on stats, and I do.
No, I'm not basing it on stats. If it's about stats, it's not even a conversation. The reason why it's a conversation is because Randy Moss is trying to take the conversation away from stats. I haven't brought up stats once. I'm just talking about what they did and what they brought to the game on the football field. Jerry Rice could play in any system. If you take Randy Moss outside of certain systems, he's not that impactful because he does not do much other than make huge plays and fancy catches. He doesn't block. He does not go across the middle. So that's going to take him out of games that are in cold weather environments or where he's going against a very physical defense.
Understand that as a player, you can appreciate things differently than just...
Jerry Rice took over that NFC Championship game in 1988 against the Chicago Bears, where I think the weather was something like negative 10 degrees.
That sheet shows. So he went on to say that he's a 6'4" beast running at a 4.2 speed, making plays, running routes. He backed up his argument, so I like it.
This is a recency bias, Renee.
Agreed.
All this is, here's the deal. Tyreek Hill is like 26 years old.
Simple as that.
Randy Moss is 58. Tyreek Hill barely, maybe might have seen Jerry Rice play. He definitely didn't see him play at the height of his career.
He didn't see Jerry Rice play. At best, he might have saw Jerry his last year in Oakland. I mean, shit, if Tyreek is 26, they went to the Super Bowl in Oakland, I think, in 2003. So that's what? That's about 18 years, 17 and a half years ago. Tyreek would have been around 8 and a half years old, maybe 9 years old. He don't remember Jerry Rice.
Jerry was dominating. I was about to give you some statistics, but now I feel stupid because you just said the statistics don't tell the whole story.
The way to win this quote-unquote debate is to stay away from the stats. Because they already know the stats are going to condemn their case that Randy Moss is the greatest player ever, pardon me, the greatest wide receiver ever. If we just stick with the stats, it's don't come. But once again, even outside of the statistical argument, Jerry Rice, for those of us who saw him play, was, I'm not going to say by far the better player, but it was discernible.
Let me do it anyway.
He also had winning intangibles. Showed up big when it counted, blocked, understood all the schemes. Randy Moss, by all accounts, is a football mastermind, very high football IQ. But what does that matter if you don't make it operational on the football field? Like, there's a reason why New England got rid of him in 2009.
1,549 catches. Randy Moss, 982 catches. When it comes to yards, Jerry Rice had almost 23,000. Randy Moss had about 15,000. Receiving touchdowns, Jerry has over 40 more. More Pro Bowls, double the amount of Pro Bowls, and maybe most importantly, Jerry...
And please keep in mind, as he stated, Jerry Rice has doubled the amount of... And please keep in mind, as Babcock stated, Jerry Rice has doubled the amount of Pro Bowls, but he played in an era with Sterling Sharp, Michael Irvin, Chris Carter, and Herman Moore. So, and that's not to mention Art Monk, Gary Clark, Henry Ellard, Flipper Anderson, a lot of other great receivers that people don't know about unless you grew up in that era. And of course, back in the late 80s, you had Anthony Carter, James Lofton with the Green Bay Packers. James Lofton might be the most underrated wide receiver ever. That dude had borderline Randy Moss athleticism, but he never had a great quarterback with the Packers back in the 80s. He was able to rejuvenate his career in his mid-30s with the Buffalo Bills in the 90s. James Lofton, unbelievable talent. But Jerry Rice was the greatest wide receiver ever, and it's not that close.
Won 3 Super Bowls. Randy Moss won none. Renee, Jerry's the GOAT.
But anyway, that's basically it on that, brothers. Peace.